Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to be looking at AoE2 with a slightly different lens than usual, and count down the 10 most historically bonkers, or maybe we should say historically creative, units in the game. Now, I'm going to restrict our scope to some degree, and try not to get hung up on units that would just be better with a different name, such as Men-at-Arms, Pikemen, and Mangonels. Men-at-Arms, of course, should be mounted units, if we want to get technical. The pikemen we see in-game are then carrying glaives, not pikes, as pikes were much longer in reality, such as you might see with Swiss pikemen or even Alexander the Great's army. Now those are pikemen. Similarly, the mangonel we see is just a run-of-the-mill onager. There's in fact an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to how mangonels, like what's shown in AoE2, are a myth, and mangonels proper were early traction-based trebuchets, which actually replaced onagers. These are cases though where I think they just went for a recognizable name that may not be technically correct, but doesn't pass the high bar of being historically bonkers in my estimation. Instead, we want units totally invented for the sake of fun game mechanics, significantly outside the time frame of AoE2 or something of that nature. Now, none of this is truly meant as criticism of the devs, of course, and is just an excuse to talk about both AoE2 and history at the same time, all in good fun. With that, let's start off with the first on our list, the Woad Raider. At a glance, this one looks alright, as just a light infantryman wielding an axe, but as you zoom in, this is clearly a unit well outside the game's scope. Note the tattoos, the name Woad Raider, the long hair, striped trousers, and elongated shield. Everything here screams 1st to 3rd century Britain or Pict, which Roman legions may have encountered, but not someone who would be fighting alongside William Wallace. Extracting dye from woad plants was definitely common in the early medieval period, as in fact the main source of blue dye, but was used on clothing, not as body paint or for tattoos. AoE2 is by no means unique in propagating this idea of Scottish soldiers painted in woad dye, with Braveheart as another notable example, combining the medieval and much earlier era together in a similar way. In fact, Braveheart coming out 2 or 3 years before work started on Age of Kings and being an extremely popular movie may have partly contributed to AoE2 going in that direction. More appropriate names could have been the Kern or Gallowglass, but maybe they decided those names weren't as well known or iconic as the woad painted Celt. For historical bonkersness, this one starts off strong, with I'll say 9 Kogos out of 10. Next up, our second historically bonkers, or historically creative unit, is the Mamaluk. Mamelukes were a class of soldier early on being entirely slave mercenaries, with Mamaluk directly translating to one who is owned. Over time though, they became a more prominent military class in Arab society, and for a period were even the ruling class over Egypt as the Mamluk Sultanate. As a unique unit for Saracens, there's no issues there, but as we dig deeper, there's a few things kind of off about this. First, throwing scimitars is automatically bonkers. It certainly explains why they're such an expensive unique unit, as a stack of swords can't be cheap, but just on the face of it is very impractical and not a real thing. The camel is also a little questionable, and every depiction I've seen has Mamelukes exclusively riding on horses. Again, it's understandable gameplay-wise to want to mix things up with a mounted ranged melee unit, and a sword being thrown makes that very clear, while a camel also makes their appearance a bit more unique and recognizable. It's fair to say though, aside from the name, there's not too much historical going on here, and I also feel bad for the poor camel having to carry the rider's quiver full of hundreds of swords on its back. I give this one 7 flying scimitars out of 10 on the bonkers scale. Moving on, we have the Korean War Wagon. Now, as a Korean unique unit, this one seems to be made up, but was I think loosely based on something real. Koreans famously invented an early form of rocket artillery called the hwacha, which was probably also the inspiration for their siege bonuses. Along with the turtle ship, these 2 technological breakthroughs are credited with helping repel the Japanese invasion of the 1590s. While you could attach a hwacha to a wagon to make it more mobile, that doesn't seem to be what's happening in AoE2. You can kind of see how a siege unit would morph into the war wagon we ended up with, and it has some striking similarity to some wagons from China, so they at least did some research into what a Korean version might have looked like. An arguably better interpretation would have been to make something similar to the nest of bees in AoE4, firing many inaccurate light projectiles and with a slow movement speed, as opposed to the almost cavalry archer direction they went with. I give this one just 5 self-driving horses out of 10 for being a little more grounded as fiction, but believable fiction. Moving on, next we have the Geniture. I know I said I wasn't going to get nitpicky about names, but this one stands out. The short version is that a group of Berber semi-nomadic tribes called the Zenata started to become known for their effective use of light cavalry, used to harass enemies and swarm around them throwing projectiles, but not necessarily charging in unless there was a perfect opportunity. This was very effective against the Spanish, and seeing that effectiveness, the Spanish incorporated similar light cavalry and skirmishing tactics for themselves. Since they fought in the so-called Zenata fashion, they co-opted the name and called themselves the Jinetes, which, if I knew how to pronounce either correctly, would probably sound similar to each other, but alas. The word Geniture then comes to us through that name Jinete. Now how we went from Zenata to Jinete to Geniture, I don't get either, but that's languages for you. While they copied the idea from Berber tribes, and that style of unit could certainly be given to the Berbers, the name is significant, as Genitures or Jinetes are specifically the Spanish version that fought back against the Berbers, using their own tactics against them. Admittedly, this is a nitpicky one, and the core idea of the unit is otherwise good, worth maybe just 4 out of 10 on our scale. Next up, we have the Gabetto. Like most things on this list, this one starts grounded in truth. These are based on the Dahomey Amazons, which were female soldiers in the kingdom of Dahomey between the 1600s and 1890s. At one point in the 1800s, women may have been up to a third of the Dahomey army, and by accounts were as good as or superior to their male counterparts in battle. It's a cool historical reference, but the snag is they had to be a little shoehorned to fit into AoE2. Not only are they mostly outside the time period, they're not even Malian per se, as Dahomey was separate in the modern region of Benin, and the game also has them throwing knives, whereas in reality they would primarily be using rifles, though as a nice touch, their knives are identical to what I found when looking up African throwing knives. The point is they work if you take Malian to just mean West African and then run with the idea of warrior women. But when we get into the details, this one's probably up there with Wold Raider as the biggest stretch we've seen so far. AoE3 actually handles this much more naturally, with the Dahomey Amazon accurately represented as mercenary rifle infantry, and they just fit that game's time period better. The fact we have photographs and not paintings to reference really says it all, and as a complete package, this is up there as a 7 out of 10 on our Bonkers scale. Moving on now, we have the Hite Wagon. Again, the premise is good, but as I brought up before in patch videos, to me this unit has gone farther and farther away from the historical inspiration in the name of gameplay, which 99% of the time is the right call, but in that 1% of the time we're talking about historical accuracy, it has to be pointed out. The inspiration was a group of Bohemian revolutionaries called the Hussites who fought against Catholics during an intra-European crusade. Being so outgunned, the Hussites had to get creative and hit on the idea of using their wagons to create makeshift defensive positions on the battlefield, firing gunpowder from inside, effectively turning an open fight into a defensive one. This ended up being very effective against cavalry charges in particular, and led to some notable victories even when heavily outnumbered. The representation in-game, though, is basically a medieval tank that can hit and run, which in some ways is the exact opposite of what it should be doing. A pack and unpack mechanic working in box formation would actually be much more accurate and fit the damage absorbing ability it has to protect units inside. For me, the hit and run element just pushes things a bit too far and gives the impression they work quite a bit differently to how they did in reality, landing them on our list. This one's again maybe nitpicky, and it's just 4 wagon wheels out of 10. Moving on, we have the Arami Swordsman. Again, this one starts out great, and the Arami is a sword with a flexible blade that works just like a whip, as shown in game. The charge mechanic damaging nearby units also seems completely reasonable, and Arami are said to be flexible enough to be worn as a belt when not in use, which is all captured. The issue is when you research Woot steel, and they suddenly ignore armor, that things get a little bonkers. Setting aside whether Woots or the closely related Damascus steel would work for an Arami sword, and we'll just grant that. The problem is the whole deal with the weapon is that it's a thin metal whip. That's dangerous against groups, no question, and I certainly wouldn't want to get too close, but it's also exactly the kind of thing a bit of armor should give a lot of protection against. If you want to pierce metal armor and any leather underneath effectively, you want something with puncturing power. A light spear thrusted with the power of a charging horse behind it penetrating armor makes a lot of sense, for example. The Arami sword is on the opposite side of the spectrum though, and making it one of only a few units in the game that can ignore armor seems a little backwards to me. It gets great marks before Woot steel, but after it whips all the way up to 8 nays out of 10. Next up, we have the Petard. Now, using small bombs to open gates and walls is completely fine, and the reason it's on the list is more about whether this was widespread enough and early enough to be a universal unit in AoE2. The earliest reference I can find to a petard is France in 1566, which is well after the introduction of cannons in Europe and really pushing the edge of the AoE2 Imperial Age timeframe. Never mind the fact you get it in Castle Age at the same time knights and crossbows are unlocked. As a unique unit, I think it would be fine, and the turtle ship is technically an even later invention, but as a generic unit given to everyone from the Huns to Mayans, it's quite a stretch for a unit/tactic that wasn't really used in that period. If you want to argue this is just a stand-in for spies and saboteurs opening gates and things of that nature, I'm open to that interpretation, but the petard as shown in game would not be a common sight. I give it 6 out of 10. Moving on, I have a similar hang-up with the fire ship. This is given to every civilization except Vikings, and makes perfect sense from a gameplay perspective to complicate water battles with more interacting unit types. In reality though, the fire ship as shown with what looks to be Greek fire is mainly associated with the Byzantines, as the history section itself acknowledges, and the recipe was a closely guarded state secret. Suggesting Byzantine-style fire ships were used by everyone from the Japanese to Incas is a stretch to say the least. You could argue this is a stand-in for ramming ships or ships using fire and close-range projectiles, and again, I'm open to an interpretive argument, so I'll give this one just 3 barrels of wildfire out of 10. Now before we get to the final entry, there's a quick honorable mention that I want to address in the Therisidae. Personally, I can't make heads or tails of this one. On the forums and Age of Empires wiki, there's some passionate and informed sounding arguments that it's completely made up, or at least has many inaccuracies. But in an interview, one of the devs says that's not true, and it's a little obscure, but they did their homework on it. At this point, I don't have an opinion either way, and all I know is they look cool and work really well against galleons. And finally, to end things with a bang, we have Ethiopian Siege units. I know Celt Siege is a big offender here too, but at least Scottish kings in the 14 and 1500s had a bit of an affinity for siege weaponry, even if it was mostly cannons, which Celts and AoE2 lack anyway. I'm going with Ethiopians though, particularly once they get their unique tech. Torsion siege engines were common in the Roman Empire, though by the Middle Ages, technology moved on to the superior traction trebuchet or mangonel, followed by the counterweight trebuchet. The story of a breakthrough in torsion engines giving Ethiopians universally feared siege is not going to get you a lot of points on a history test. The effect of larger blast radius also sounds more like explosive rounds than anything, so the name is also a little confused. Obviously, the problem is there aren't that many great candidates for civs to specialize in siege, but late game Ethiopians seems a little arbitrary, and it's a clear case where gameplay took precedence. I'll give it 7 epic onager shots out of 10. That's my list of 10 units in AoE2 that took some creative liberties with history for the sake of gameplay. Prior to making this video, I actually had several other entries planned, which once I did some digging, turned out to be way more accurate than I expected, to my surprise. I think it would make for a nice follow-up to look at units that are in fact more historically accurate than you might expect, and I'm looking forward to making that as a complement video to this one. That'll do it for this one though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.